Today on CityCast DC, we're coming up on Halloween, and today we're sitting down with historian Mark Benbow. He's going to take us back to a time when seances and ouija boards were a popular pastime across DC, including in the sitting rooms of the rich and powerful. It's a wild history, and it's actually not as long ago as you might think. Today is Wednesday, October 22nd. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Mark.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm flattered you asked. Thank you.
All right. So we in Washington, we like to think of ourselves as these rational, empirical creatures. You've done some research into periods when DC became obsessed with reaching the other world. When was this, and how commonplace was it?
It was very commonplace, not just in DC. This was something that was very commonplace all through the U.S. and Britain in particular. But it began with the spiritualism movement in the 1840s in what was called the burned-over district of New York, which sounds grim. But that was just, there were so many spiritual revivals in upstate New York in the early 19th century that the joke was that it was just burned over by the Holy Spirit and religious revivals. This is where the Mormons came from. And groups like the Adventists, who predicted the world would end in 1844. Spoiler, it didn't.
They're not that far off.
And the spiritualist movement began with a group, a small number of sisters, the Fox sisters, that claimed to be communicating with the spirit of a murdered man that communicated through raps or knocks, one for yes, two for no kind of thing. That went on and got more and more elaborate as increasing number of women. And it's interesting that this really was a movement dominated by women, as acting as mediums that would communicate with spirits of those who had passed on. And it went from just knocks for yes or no, which made messaging really difficult. And then they began channeling voices, and then claimed that tables would levitate, musical instruments out of nowhere would play, there are all sorts of things like that. It was largely dominated by women, because this is an era where you really don't have many opportunities as women whatsoever. But this was a sphere where women were accepted as this was legitimate. They could be leaders of this, and it really spread widely. Of course, it's most famous for D.C. because Mary Todd Lincoln was a very big believer. They had several sons, and only the oldest, Robert, made it to adulthood. And one of their sons died of typhus in the White House. And she really found comfort in being reassured that in the afterlife, they were healthy, they were happy. That Civil War gave a huge boost to it because, your family member disappeared, or you get word that he died hundreds of miles away. And as part of the mourning process, it was very reassuring to hear that the afterlife was pleasant and they were safe and happy and would be there when when the living family members passed over or moved on after they had died.
So was Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, doing this sort of stuff in the White House with audiences, or with, I don't mean audiences, but with socially, with other people, or was it just alone in her room?
There'd be other. You need to have several people there generally. At least you had to have the medium there. And President Lincoln would be there. I'm not sure if he was a true believer or if he just wanted the reassurance, or if he's there to support his wife.
So, when Nancy Reagan was one of the books about her said she'd consulted an astrologer to schedule stuff. And there was a lot of sort of political backlash that was really looked down on at the time. take us back to this period that you're writing about. Was there a similar kind of opprobrium attached among the sort of quote unquote normal people?
There wasn't like huge scandals about it, but it was the kind of thing that you didn't publicize and talk a lot about in public. The newspapers and the society columns would not say, oh, Mrs. Harding visited her medium last night at the White House. Mrs. Harding was a big believer.
So give me the rogues gallery here. Your research. We've got like Arthur Conan Doyle. We've got Mrs.
Arthur
Harding.
Conan Doyle was a huge believer.
What were these people all doing in D.C. and doing on this Edith Wilson? And what kind of spiritual stuff were they up to here?
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle was a huge believer in spiritualism, which became and remains a church. And it's ironic that the man who created possibly the most logical detective in history was really, frankly, gullible. Even mediums that had been exposed by people like Houdini as frauds. Houdini loved exposing frauds. He hoped he'd find a real medium, but never did. And it didn't matter. Doyle believed that there was an afterlife called Summerland, and that it was pleasant, and people would be there, and you'd be with your loved ones and family. And he would go on tours around Britain and the U.S. and Canada and give these addresses talking about the afterlife. And people found it comforting. Mrs. Hyrick, from Christian Hyrick's third wife, was a big believer.
For the uninitiated, that is the big brewery in D.C. of those days and now again.
Yeah, their mansion is a wonderful house museum not far from DuPont Circle. But both the Hyricks believed they had lost a baby girl who had died as an infant, and they liked going to seances, and they held seances in their mansion on New Hampshire Avenue. They would go to public presentations and listen to speeches and talks about life after death, and they found this very comforting. And it was associated with women, so when you look at descriptions of who's there, they usually emphasize, it was the wife of this senator, the wife of this ambassador, this cabinet member's wife.
Did these descriptions show up like in the newspaper?
Sometimes, yeah. And, they wouldn't name. They wouldn't say, Senator Hitchcock's wife was at such and such. But you did see that, there are a lot of limousines associated with the Senate or the rich, or the embassies were seen outside of Mrs. Warnke's home. Mrs. Julia Warnke was one of the popular mediums in D.C. that specialized, basically, her clientele were among the movers and shakers in D.C.
Mark the date. This November 8th in D.C., join the National Center for Victims of Crime for its 40th anniversary gala. It's an evening of celebration and sparkle, with dinner and a silent auction filled with one-of-a-kind treasures. Raise a glass with friends, honor champions of hope, and help make sure life-changing support for crime survivors remains accessible. Join NCVC for an unforgettable night of connection and purpose, all while supporting services that make a real difference in your community. Go to victimsofcrime.org/40 today to grab your tickets and join us for this unforgettable night. That's victimsofcrime.org/40. Life can flip on a dime. 1 minute, everything's normal, and the next, someone else's mistake shakes your world upside down. And that's when you need a team you can count on. NACE Law Group has been standing up for D.C. families for decades, fighting for neighbors hurt by medical malpractice, wrongful deaths, and serious injuries. They don't just settle quickly or push papers. They dig in, fight hard, and make sure every client gets the justice they deserve. And here's something that I personally love about them. They are a longtime supporter of this very podcast. Because just like us, and just like you, they care about this community and the folks who call it home. So if you've been hurt or someone that you care about has, just pick up the phone. Call NACE Law Group. They'll stand with you, fight for your family, and make sure your rights are protected. And who knows, maybe you'll even see him at a CityCast live show. Visit WashingtonDCInjuryLawyers.com. That's WashingtonDCInjuryLawyers.com.
So what I think I hear you saying is this phenomenon nationally that was, I think, particularly embraced among elites.
No, it's just they're the ones who get covered.
Okay, I gotcha. But was it any more pronounced in Washington than anywhere else?
Not that I've seen, but there are places where it is more pronounced. There's a town in New York where the whole town's spiritualist, and it's still that way today. The advantage to DC is who your clientele will be. And the same thing would be true in New York City.
Meaning your clientele will be rich?
Yeah, rich and powerful.
Right.
It's more fun, I imagine, to channel a spirit and talk with somebody whose, husband is a power in the country or in the city than it is, your husband's a clerk downtown, the equivalent of what now would be a GS11. It's more fun to know, your ambassador. The ambassador's wife is your customer, not the wife of a librarian at the Library of Congress.
Right. Probably still true. But you've also talked about how this did become like controversial in the sense that they were like clashes in the halls of Congress between spiritualists and more traditional believers.
Yeah, there had been campaigns in D.C. to try to debunk these things. The Evening Star, which most people that know D.C. history know, that was the big paper, not the Post or the Times, did an expose where they had a couple of reporters went separately as individuals and kind of started going to seances and all that, and finally had a reading done. And the medium declared that this young female reporter, that her mother was on the other side and her baby that passed away was there with the mother, and they were fine, et cetera, et cetera. And in the article, the reporter said, one, my mom is still alive, and two, I'm not married, and I've never been married, and I've never had a kid.
Right.
It made no effect whatsoever.
It made no effect whatsoever, meaning that these exposés came out and nobody stopped going?
Yeah, they just, there's probably a dip in their business, but they just kept going. And Arthur Conan Doyle was like that. Houdini would show him how a trick is done, and Doyle would deny it and claim that Houdini really had magical powers and was for some reason denying it.
Well, so listen, when you get to a thing where someone is claiming magical power and taking money from someone else in order to communicate or whatever, that also kind of opens the door for people who are just out to steal other people's money. And we're talking about this era, post the progressive era, when there was a lot of like lawmaking about like we should do stuff to regulate the kinds of people who would swindle other kinds of people. Was there any of that going on, that legally people were doing stuff that got them in danger?
Yeah, there were. For one thing, in D.C., you had to pay a license, and you had to have lived in D.C. for a year. You had to have no fewer than 10 letters of reference from D.C. residents of high character, and then it was like a $25 license fee for the year. And that's a lot of money in the beginning of the 20th century. That's several $100s now. And DC made money doing these licenses. There were estimated 1,000 or so mediums and fortune tellers of various stripes. In 1926, Congress tried to pass a law to ban these practices for money in DC. And that's what you mentioned earlier, that the hearings were just a zoo. The chair totally lost control. And you had the hearing room packed with spiritualists and mediums, and including leaders of the spiritualist churches. And you had people like Houdini testifying in favor of the bill. The problem was the bill was so loosely written. They tried to be specific, but the spiritualist churches were legitimate churches. They weren't there to make money. They really were believers. And the bill would have banned many of their practices. There was a concern, for example, if the spiritualist church pass the plate around for offerings, as churches do, would that violate this law? And at one point, the audience is yelling at Houdini, who's yelling back. He offers a cash reward for anybody that can prove he's a real medium. They're a real medium. And they're yelling at him how awful he was. One of the witnesses blamed the Jews for the bill. And, anti-Semitism pops up here. The bill died because the committee decided they couldn't outlaw frauds without also banning legitimate religious beliefs in these churches.
Was there any memorable reveal in a DC seance that went public beyond the people in the room?
In the 1930s, one of the biggest, Madame Marcia published an article in the American magazine that claimed that she had predicted, she had told Edith Galt that she would live in a White House one day, and 6 years later, she meets and marries Woodrow Wilson, becomes First Lady. But of course, these claims are being made in 1937.
Did any evidence ever come up, a la Nancy Reagan, that any sort of key decisions of government or big shots happened because of information gathered in a seance?
Supposedly, they predicted change some of his travel plans, leave at an auspicious time. But I'm not saying there isn't any official confirmation. I've just not seen it. Again, I've really focused on my era, which is the early 20th century. There is one funny thing in an article in 1921 where Madame Marcia made predictions about the future, not claiming what she said 15 years before. She went over 3. She made 3 predictions about Harding.
Yeah. Well, what were her 3 predictions?
She said, okay, the next 2 years will be favorable to the Harding administration.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he dies in office and had already been caught up in the Teapot Dome scandals.
Swing and a miss.
Yeah, she predicted that Germany would pay its reparations from World War I in full.
Swing and a miss.
And she claimed that the Allies would pay their war debts in full.
All right.
That's a swinging strike 3. But again, she didn't like to make, that I've seen in the papers in D.C., specific predictions. She liked saying what she had predicted in the past. Oh, well, 5 years ago I said this would happen. Where's the documentation?
So this all sort of went away, I suppose, around the country and in Washington too. I'm curious, how did it happen that something that was as late as the 30s, you've got these stories, and then by 20 years later, these people would have been laughed at as kooks?
Yeah, they do fade over time. I think in part because they met a specific need after the Civil War and then after World War I, that you wanted reassurance. There were best-selling books in the 19-teens talking about messages from the other side. You don't see them nearly as much after World War II. And it's funny, the Ouija board really becomes more of a child's toy with the baby boom than you had before, where it was a parlor game but also was taken very seriously. I think, don't know for sure, but what I've been thinking about with this is it loses popularity because it was so, where's the big success? Where's the person that came out and said, oh, John F. Kennedy should not go to Dallas, and saves his life kind of thing. So you don't have that popularized, enormous success that would spread this beyond people trying to get some reassurance.
I'm curious if you see any parallels with this era now. I mean, we're in a moment of kind of radical reaction against science and against sort of traditional rules, traditional politeness, traditional what have you. Is there stuff that era can teach us now?
Well, I don't know. if I saw these same people now, I'm sure the phrase "do your own research" would pop up.
Right.
Why don't trust experts? Do your own. Yeah, Dr. Google University will tell you everything you need to know. I think that in the past 20 years or so, the easy availability of irrationality has led to its popularity, that people that would not have been exposed to things like the flat earth would not have been losing themselves down the rabbit hole, running searches and watching videos on YouTube and TikTok. I remember when the World Wide Web, as we know it, was brand new. There were some really kooky sites out there, and we would look at them and laugh at them. Oh, look at this. The Time Cube site, this poor guy, legitimately mentally ill. Now he'd find all sorts of followers. And I think it's the access that spiritualism is still around, still popular. People still do seances and ghost hunts. How many TV shows are there that do ghost hunts now? The History Channel. I always kind of laugh at the name now, a seance with a Bigfoot ice truck driver kind of show. Will tell you about ancient aliens. The access is there, and people having access discover they like this, they believe it, and then with the market being what it is, that means more of it becomes available. And I think that as spiritualism lacked enormous popularly known successes, people moved away from it. Some of it may have also been, it was a form of popular entertainment. And as technology developed, there are more and more forms of popular entertainment competing with it.
So TV killed spiritualism.
Well, it's like movies killed vaudeville,
right?
As did radio and then television. And that won't peel off the true believers that are spiritualists that believe, the people that would go to a spiritualist church. It's not going to peel them off, but it'll peel off the group saying, oh, what are we going to do this weekend? I know, let's go to a seance. That'll be fun.
Hey, before I let you bounce, why this subject? I mean, you've thrown some academic research into this. Why is this fun and interesting and relevant to revisit and think about in DC now?
I'm a semi-retired history professor, and my specialty is Woodrow Wilson and the early 20th century. And I've started becoming interested in folklore as a form of entertainment in the era I study. I'm thinking about writing another book, this one on just that subject, things like seances and ghost stories, celebrating Halloween as a form of folklore in the early 20th century. And I've lived in the DC area most of my adult life now. And then because I used to be the historian at the Woodrow Wilson House Museum 20 years ago, I know that while Wilson was not a believer, his second wife's brother and brother-in-law were and held seances. So I kept coming across it. And I thought, well, this is an interesting way for people to spend their time and money. And this was really bigger than I really had thought much about. And for a historian, that was just, an unbelievably good bait to draw me into my research.
Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope to see you and other people at Profs and Pints. They give lots of great talks, and I'll be giving my talk on this again probably in the fall of 26.
Nice. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. And today I'm doing a seance from the CityCast Neighbors Club. You can join that club at membership.citycast.fm. And we'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city.